quit with the banter and start with the official good-to-go information on tonight's Google Hangout. Hey folks, welcome to the Safety Solutions Academy Google Hangout number 15 tonight. We're going to spend some time this evening talking about some really important critical defensive skills. Skills that in a way relate to a handgun, but in other ways, these are some of the most important skills that maybe don't relate to the handgun at all. Or maybe they relate in a way that keeps us from ever having to use the handgun. And maybe that's what makes them so critical. You know, I'm ready and willing to use my handgun should I need to, but it's one of those things that I want to avoid just about at any cost. Now I say just about because there are some costs that are too high to bear, but there are a lot of things that I can do as an armed citizen, as a legally armed citizen, to try and minimize the likelihood of needing to use that handgun. And that's what we're going to talk about today in the second part of our series about critical defensive skills. And of course, as usual on Thursday nights, I know it's a Friday, but on Thursday nights we have Grant Cunningham that joins us. Welcome, Grant. How are you doing tonight?
I am terrific, Paul. Thanks for asking.
Excellent, Grant. I'm glad to hear it. I'm really looking forward to our conversation about critical defensive skills. So we have to understand what these critical defensive skills are and how it is that we can put those critical defensive skills into play, how we can train them and be prepared to use them when we need to. And these are skills that really don't have anything to do, or maybe, like I said, they have everything to do with a handgun, and we're going to get into that a little bit. Those of you that are joining us maybe for the first time and haven't heard me say this, welcome to the Safety Solutions Academy Google Hangout. It's where everyday people come to understand what it is that personal security really is, to try and unravel the complexities of defensive training, and to demystify the gun. And we're going to really be talking about all of those things wrapped up in one big crazy ball tonight, and I'm looking forward to it. If you are here, make sure you check in on the right-hand side of your screen. The questions and answers are enabled. We've already talked to Joe. I know I've got a bunch of viewers that are down there. Tell us who you are, where you're from. We'll say hello, and make sure you're asking questions. The more you interact, the more these Google Hangouts are beneficial to you and to everybody else that's involved. And if you're watching on YouTube after the fact or on Google Plus after the fact, chime in with those comments. The other thing you folks can do to make this Google Hangout more successful for everybody is to go up to the top on the little URL bar in your browser, highlight that, and tweet that out. Let people know where you're at, what you're doing, and what we're talking about. Send it out on Facebook. Share it on Google+. Send it an email to your mother-in-law who you think would be interested in what it is we're talking about. We'd love to have all of you join us. So those things will help make our Google Hangout more enjoyable. So, Grant, we had a great discussion last week about critical defensive skills. You got an email, and we got a lot of emails talking about critical defensive skills and where people think this series should go. But the email that you got really kind of stood out. Do you want to share with us at least the gist of that email?
Sure. This one came in from Tom. Tom was active. He asked a couple questions on the Hangout, and he sent me a nice email. He said, you know, thank you for the Hangout. I'm looking forward to the next one, so Tom, I hope you're here tonight. And he talks about what he thinks about when he hears about critical defense skills, and to him, beyond the firearm manipulation and carry methods, as he puts it, he said awareness, managing distractions, confidence, not looking like an easy target, he said, are the things that he thinks about first. In fact, in his email is really the first line when he talks about the things that he talks about in terms of critical defensive skills. And then, of course, he goes on through the firearm stuff and the one-handed skills and shooting from the ground and all that other stuff. But and then he talks about risk and will your actions put other people in harm's way. So there's a lot of stuff there that he's considering that we don't usually think about when we talk about critical defensive skills. And yet they are. You know, Miles Davis has once said about jazz, he said, it's the notes that you don't play that really matter. And to an extent, I think we can say the same thing about critical defensive skills, because it's the stuff that you don't do, perhaps, outside, or the things outside of actually shooting that might just matter. Remember, when we're talking about self-defense, and I talk about this quite a lot with people, and we talk about things like detection and avoidance and de-escalation and deterrence, and then response. And remember that the firearm is really only useful in that response phase. It's all the other stuff that comes before that, all the stuff that we don't think about as being a defensive skill because they don't involve shooting, that really is the stuff that keeps us safe. The shooting is part of the response phase, and it's really important. If we need that response phase, we really do need it, and it's important that we have those shooting skills. But all the other stuff that comes before that is the stuff that might just not only keep us out of trouble, but keep us from having to shoot in the first place.
And that really should be our goal, Grant. You know, I'm a firm believer that from a marketing standpoint, you know, being involved in a shooting for an instructor is one of those things that really kind of sets instructors apart. And really, I believe that it should be exactly the opposite. People should be looking for the instructors that haven't been in an armed conflict. Maybe it's those things that that instructor has to share that might be what it is we really need to understand, just like you talked about. Detection, awareness, de-escalation, avoidance. The response is just a tiny little part of it, and that's pretty huge. So, Grant, let's talk a little bit about what skills are first, because a lot of the emails that we got talked about outcomes, and that's really not what it is that we're after. You know, maybe in real life we're after the outcome, but we have to think about the skills and what a skill is before we can really get there. So when you think about skills, what do you think about as a skill?
A skill is a practiced knowledge, I think, is when I think about it, when I think about a skill, I think about a practiced knowledge. In other words, we have an insight into something that we need to do. And it may be physical, it may be mental, whatever that is. But we have an insight into what we need to do, and then we practice doing that, or we get used to doing that, or we develop the ability to do that. And that's the skill. As you said, the outcome isn't the skill. The outcome is the result of the application of that skill. But the skill to me is that practiced knowledge, that applied insight that we use, and it can be physical, it might be mental, but they're still skills.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and dive into the email that you got from Tom, and really the big concept that we want to address from that email. And that big concept is the idea of those skills that are critical to avoid using the gun at all. And let's start kind of where we spent a little bit of time last week. Let's talk about awareness. Now, to me, awareness is something different than it is to much of the industry. I don't necessarily teach, you know, levels of awareness, whether based on color codes or words that associate with things. I help people to understand that awareness really is just keying in on important cues in our environment that help us to understand what it is that we need to do and how it is we can interact. But really the key that people need to understand about awareness to me is it plays into a bigger picture of what's called avoidance. Because I think that awareness is one of the skills that helps to deselect people as prey. When you appear confident, when you know what's going on around you, when you appear to be one of those people that's tuned in to your surroundings, the bad guy or the predator is probably likely to select someone else to deal with. They don't want to deal with someone that looks like they can handle themselves. They want an easy mark. What are your thoughts about awareness, Grant?
Yeah, I'm of much the same way. Awareness, and I've said this before, awareness doesn't work the way most people think it does, because everybody believes that they can ratchet up their awareness and somehow get an advance notice of something that's going to happen to them in time for them to employ some special ninja skill that they've got. It doesn't work that way. We don't have reserves of this magic awareness that we can call on. We all have a certain amount of attention that we can pay to things, and we have to decide how we're going to apportion that attention as we go through our day. And I talk about it in terms of managing distractions, and that's really what it is, because we can choose to be distracted about certain things. We can choose how much distraction we want to have, and the rest of the attention that we have is used for everything else. What we can do is we can choose where to direct our attention. We can choose not to be staring at our cell phone while walking down the city street, for instance. That's a good example. by doing that, as you said, we end up looking less like prey to the predator. And I really hate to use that term because it's so cliched, but it's very, very true. If you're walking down the street with your head buried in your cell phone and you're looking at it, versus somebody who's up looking around doing something other than being distracted all the time, which one looks more like prey to you? And it's the guy with his head buried in the cell phone. So I talk about deciding where you're going to put your attention and managing your distractions as part of that awareness portion and looking less like a criminal. It's not that you're going to have some incredible prescient knowledge that you're about to be attacked. The point is to deter that attack and hopefully get an idea of what's going on around you before the attack actually happens. That's really the key.
Absolutely, and I agree with that, Grant. I think it's one of those things in the industry that has really misunderstood the idea of awareness and what it accomplishes, and the idea that I'm going to be so focused on everything that's happening in the surroundings to see the bad guy coming, to know that he's going to attack, to know what the attack is, to be able to set up the counter. And if I do all of that and the bad guy still attacks, holy smokes, that's really far out there. And that's one of the big challenges that I think people face when it comes to awareness. Now, I think it's also important for people to note that neither you nor I is suggesting that we should be anything other than aware. We both believe that awareness is an important part of living a happy and successful and hopefully crime-free life. But the fact of the matter is it probably just doesn't play the way most people think that it plays when we think about Cooper or the way the NRA teaches or anybody else teaches awareness. And that's the key that I want to get people at. Again, it ties into the big picture of avoidance. So let's go there next. I want to avoid violent crime in my life. And there are some important reasons why. The consequences of violence are pretty severe or potentially pretty severe. And one of the problems is violence is chaotic. I don't know what's going to happen in that violence. And the more I'm involved with violence and the longer I'm involved with violence, the more likely I am to face those very serious consequences of violence. I don't want that. That's why avoidance is so very important to me. And so awareness plays into that avoidance, but that's not going to do it by itself. What other thoughts do you have about the idea of avoidance, Grant?
Well, avoidance starts, to a certain extent, it starts with before you head out the door in the morning, sort of pre-planning and thinking about where you're going. John Farnham is attributed with the saying, "Don't go to stupid places and do stupid things with stupid people." And that is, not doing those things is part of avoidance. Again, it's not the notes you play; it's notes that you don't play that are important. And if you don't go to stupid places with stupid people and do stupid things, you've already avoided a huge number of things that can happen. Now, of course, crime occurs anywhere. We know that. We accept that. But we also know that certain crimes occur with greater frequency in certain areas or at certain times or with certain people more than others.
Right.
And the first step in avoidance is not going to those places, not hanging with those people, not doing those things. That's part of it. That doesn't mean that you live your life sequestered like a monk by any stretch of the imagination. Just that before you go out the door in the morning that you understand that maybe there are some things you shouldn't be doing. And that is probably the first step in avoidance. It's just not going there in the first place.
And let's talk specifically, Grant, about what some of those places are. What kinds of places are more likely to have crime than others? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we have both social crime and asocial crime. The social crime are those things that occur as a result of an interaction between you and somebody. The asocial types are ones that happen simply because you're picked as prey for whatever reason. So there are two different types. But in general, if for instance, I avoid dive bars. That's a really good example of a place where social violence happens all the time. And it's a very, very good example. There are certainly certain parts of the city that I wouldn't walk down at night. That's another example of avoiding, stupid places. There was a point in time, years and years ago, I used to teach advanced photography classes, and we used to take a field trip into downtown Portland, Oregon, which is not a huge city, but a pretty good sized city.
Right.
And we used to head down there, and we used to start at about 11 o'clock at night, and we used to go to about 2 a.m., sometimes 3 a.m., taking pictures, available light in downtown Portland. Now imagine this, you've got 5 or 6 people running around with bags full of very expensive camera equipment. And the reason I know is because I sold most of it to these people.
Right.
And so we're walking around with, tens of thousands of dollars of camera equipment in really bad parts of the town, because we were trying to get pictures of night people, what they were doing. That's an example of doing something really stupid. I wouldn't do that anymore, and quite frankly, I'm amazed that we lived through it. But today, I would think twice about that. That's a really good example of a place that I just won't go anymore, that I might have at one time without this knowledge of what happens on the street and what happens to people who do things like that.
And I like that example, Grant, because it also illustrates for us the concept that we need to grow and learn and change. And whether we're instructors and authors and Google Hangout hosts or not, we always have room to grow, and that's a perfect example of that. One of the places that I work really hard to avoid is spending time in gas stations, in the convenience store area of the gas station. We know that that's a place that is often a target of criminals to do bad things. Same kind of idea when you look at just the regular old party store, depending on what part of the country you're from, just the convenience store idea. When I need fuel, I love the fact that I can use my credit or debit card right there at the pump, because it keeps me out of that place where I may have a higher likelihood to encounter problems. I can secure myself in my vehicle with the doors locked, and I can drive away at a moment's notice if I needed to, if things were to arrive. If I'm inside that party store, inside that convenience store, I don't have those options. And so those are just 2 examples of places where we can work to try and avoid those challenges. Now, if I need to get a bottle of water because I'm thirsty and I'm driving all night and I'm trying to stay awake and I'm like you and need cinnamon candies because I fall asleep anytime I sit down, right? Then maybe I'm going to go into that convenience store, because the risk of not doing so outweighs what it is that the risk of going in, the possibility that we'll face violent crime. So those are excellent examples. What other techniques of avoidance are there, Grant? What other things do we need to think about when it comes to avoidance?
Well, I think we need to think ahead in terms of what kind of people are hanging around.
Mm-hmm.
That's always, of course, part of it. Think about the positions in which you're going to place yourself. Positions that you don't usually think of, perhaps, but that might leave you in a spot where you are more vulnerable. For instance, and this is a little delicate, but for the males in the audience, going into and using a urinal in a public restroom in, say, a sports venue, probably not a good idea. Your back is turned, you can't see what's going on around you. You have placed yourself in a relatively vulnerable position. So think about those positions where you are vulnerable, where you can't see what's going on around you, where you can't apportion your attention because you're physically blocked from doing so. Things like that. Thinking about any of those times when you're put into a position where somebody else can have a superior position over you.
Yeah, and Grant, you bring up a really good point, and I don't think you at all mean that you shouldn't use the restroom while you're in a crowded place. The simple solution to that is to step into a stall and use the latch on the door to provide yourself additional warning of something that's happening. Nobody's going to be pounding on a door if you're using a urinal, but if you're using the toilet to go to the bathroom, they're going to have to get through the door first, which gives you some opportunity. Time provides opportunity, and that's one of the keys that we can use to help to avoid dangerous situations. So avoidance is a pretty big situation. No matter how aware we are, no matter how hard we try to avoid, no matter how much we spend time avoiding doing stupid things with stupid people in stupid places, trouble can still find us. Then that leads us to the ways to deal with trouble that might not have to do with a handgun. De-escalation. Talk to me about how it is that you frame de-escalation when you teach courses.
Well, de-escalation, we usually think of in terms of social violence, where we've had an interaction with somebody and there's been some sort of an exchange that gets ratcheted up to a dangerous position. And I talked about de-escalation in terms of, first of all, not being a jerk. Believe it or not being a jerk is a really good way of de-escalating most situations. And what we see a lot in social violence are situations where people have gotten themselves into these things because they didn't want to be dissed, or they wanted to make sure that somebody understood that they were important, or they were, well, whatever. So first of all, not being a jerk is a really good method of de-escalation. Of course, we talk about verbal de-escalation, about
Sure.
ratcheting back the tone of voice and the words that you use, and how you deliver them and things like that, to avoid prolonging conflict. And so we talk about that, of course. And those are the typical things that we think about when we talk about de-escalation.
Yeah, I look at it really in three ways. And from a legal standpoint, Grant, really what it comes down to is the idea of preclusion, and the idea of precluding all other options before violence is used to solve the problem. And what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to avoid violence by swallowing my pride. You know, hey, buddy, you're right. It was your spot, my mistake. Let me get in my vehicle, get out of here, and let you have your spot. I apologize. I had no intention to offend you, and I'm sorry. You know, maybe it was your spot, but maybe you just need to go with the idea that, hey, he's going to be a jerk. He wants to engage in violence. Best case scenario, you know, swallow your pride. The second part of that is leave the situation. If you can just exit from that situation, if that's a possibility, that is such a better option than getting involved in violence. You can spend the rest of your life thinking about that violence. And I'd rather it be a long life because I left than have it be a really short life because I decided to engage in violence and then suffer those consequences, which I have less control than I'd like. You know, so when we think about that, verbal de-escalation, sometimes it's just a matter of not needing to win the argument, not needing to win that verbal dispute, that posturing. No problem. I can look like the dope in a situation to avoid being involved in violence. There's no doubt about that. And leaving the situation in some areas, that's a legal requirement. And
Exactly.
really, even if it's not a legal requirement, isn't that a better option than being involved in a shooting, defensive or otherwise? I don't want to have to deal with that. What are your thoughts on that, Grant?
That's true. You know, I think a lot of times, a lot of people get into this sort of Walter Mitty attitude that, gosh, it'd be really great to be able to protect myself with my handgun. When in reality, we have to remember that shooting somebody, perhaps especially if they don't die from the encounter, is a life-altering experience. It will bankrupt you. The chance of going to jail are actually pretty good. Not to mention the social stigma attached to it. So
Right.
when I look at that, when I weigh all of that against simply swallowing my pride and making the situation go away by essentially taking the blame, as it were. I hate to put it that way, but that's really what it is. If I can do something to de-escalate the situation so I don't have to draw my gun, so I don't have to shoot at anybody, that's a much, much better solution than spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on my defense, bankrupting myself, losing my property, losing my social standing, and maybe even going to jail.
Yeah.
It's a really good trade-off for me. Unfortunately, for some people it doesn't seem to be.
And I can understand that. I mean, there was a time in my life, Grant, when being right was important. You know, sometimes even today, depending on who it is that I'm engaged with, you know, the ego that's involved can be a challenge to overcome. But that's one of those things that all of us need to work on. These can also be important skills to understand that they may be skills that can help to buy you time. Feigning submission or things like that may buy you time that you need to make up your mind about how you're going to act, or to wait for that opportunity to react with that response, armed or otherwise. And so these skills are good skills to have, whether or not you actually end up using them. It's important to think about. As I mentioned, even though we might be willing to take the blame, hey buddy, my fault. I apologize for offending you. You know what, I'm going to get out of here and let you get on with your life. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Well, that guy might not accept that. That individual, that person that you've offended in some way that you may not even understand, may still want to engage in violence. And that leads us to that response. One of the things that challenges me in this training world that we live in today is the idea that people have one response tool. And that response tool is, where the majority of the emails that we got wanted to talk about the use of the handgun as a lethal force tool. There's a time and a place for that. Just like there's a time and a place for verbal de-escalation, there's a time and a place for a lethal force response. But it isn't always there. What other skills are important for someone that's interested in self-defense to have to make sure that they have that whole spectrum of opportunities available when they need them, Grant?
Well, remember that the handgun, or the rifle or the shotgun for that matter, but
sure.
Particularly the handgun, because that's what we have with us, is a lethal force tool. It's to be used in situations where we face immediate and otherwise unavoidable danger of death or grave bodily harm. And that's a pretty particular set of circumstances. There are a whole lot of other things that don't rise to that level of force. And so we should be prepared to deliver an appropriate level of force if we're faced with something that does not warrant lethal force. Hand skills certainly play into this, very important. Having non-lethal tools with you. Things like, for some people, they might be Kubotans. I'm a big fan of the flashlight as an impact tool and as a distraction tool. Perhaps chemical or electrical devices, the pepper sprays and the civilian tasers. Very, very good tools for when the lethal response is not yet warranted. And if your response is limited to either running away or lethal response, you've got that whole bunch of stuff in the middle that's really probably more common that you can't deal with. You have to either put yourself in a situation where you're less safe by trying to run away and you can't, or you have to go directly to that lethal response, which may not be warranted. So those intermediate non-lethal responses are incredibly important when we talk about the response phase to violence.
Absolutely, Grant. Folks, I know that I've got a bunch of you, Grant and I have a bunch of you out there that are watching. Don't forget that over on the right-hand side of the screen, you can chime in with your questions. As we're going through these ideas and these skills, don't hesitate to chime in with questions or comments that you have. I'd be happy to address them over on that right-hand bar. They'll pop up in the video after the fact as well, so people will know who it is that's commenting and what's going on. So feel free to chime in. Grant, when we talk about the idea of having other responses other than the firearm, it's one of those things that a lot of people don't really spend time thinking about. And you hit on one of the important ideas of why they do need to think about it. They may not be warranted. They may legally not have the standing to use lethal force to solve the problem they have. And so therefore, we are going to want to have unarmed skills and skills with intermediate tools, whether that be a chemical defense spray, a Kubotan, as you mentioned, or some kind of impact weapon, electronic control devices, and a myriad of other possibilities as well. One of the things that I think people miss out on is the idea that you may not have your firearm when you need it, and so you may need to depend on other skills to solve the problem. And also, don't forget the fact that you may need some of those skills to be able to access your firearm, even if you are warranted in a legal manner to use that firearm. You may need to use your hands, elbows, knees, feet, teeth, chemical defense spray, whatever the case might be, to be able to gain access to that firearm so that you can use it. And so those skills are incredibly important. And no, they're not critical defensive handgun skills, but in that situation, they could be critical defensive skills, certainly. And so I encourage all of my students to definitely make sure that they take a look at unarmed combatives and some kind of an intermediate technique. We can also possess those intermediate tools in a lot of places where we can't possess a handgun. Legal or not, I'll guarantee you that there is pepper spray in schools across America on keychains of students and staff members, in purses, in vehicles, where firearms are strictly prohibited against the law and people would never think to carry them there. And those are things to think about, having that kind of an intermediate tool. And we saw that in Seattle, I believe it was. The hall monitor had chemical defense spray and was able to stop the assailant in the shooting just yesterday in Seattle. An intermediate defensive tool did a great job in solving a lethal problem. And so we have to think about things from that standpoint. And you know, Grant, I'm looking at my notes, and one of the things I didn't mention about critical defensive skills that we've talked about a little bit is the idea of medical skills. If you think that you're going to be involved in violence, then you probably need to know how to deal with some of the consequences of violence, and that's medical damage. What are your thoughts about medical training?
You know, when we consider what we're talking about is this overall concept of personal safety is what we're really talking about. And the fact is, I am more likely to suffer traumatic injury from a car accident, or actually, you know, around my farm from any number
Right.
of accidents. I could be,
Right.
you know, I operate a tractor with power equipment on it all the time. I operate power tools, all of these things that I might need these medical skills just in everyday life, precluding any violence. And these things are far more likely to happen to me than somebody stabbing me.
Right.
Even so, when we take those skills out into and we start talking about the response to violence, being able to keep myself alive is an incredibly important skill to have after I've been attacked. Perhaps it's not me who's been attacked. Maybe it's been somebody, an innocent, maybe a loved one, or somebody I'm walking around at the mall and somebody gets shot. Having those medical skills to save my loved ones, or even the innocent person there, prove to be in many cases far more valuable than my skills with a handgun, because they're useful over a much greater variety of circumstances. So medical skills are incredibly important. I think perhaps if I had to pick one skill that people should train in, and as a firearms trainer, I'm probably cutting my throat. I'm probably cutting your throat.
Right.
We're both firearms trainers. But I think it's far more important to get a good trauma class in place before you come visit me or before you go visit Paul. Knowing how to deal with massive blood loss is part and parcel of everyday life. And I think when we talk about safety as an overriding goal, that's important.
I can't agree with you more, Grant. You know, I've said this before, and I don't know if I've said it with you on the air with other guests. Fact of the matter is, I've been in exactly 0 gunfights in my existence, and I know that on 3 separate occasions I've administered medical aid that has made life-saving difference in an individual's existence. I'm not different than most people. Uncle Frank having a heart attack at the Thanksgiving dinner table is much more likely than a gunfight. End of story. And if you're not thinking about that in the sense of personal safety, then you're missing it. And it's kind of funny because, as I mentioned, it's not in our notes. You know, we didn't put that down as a topic to talk about today, but I think it's an important one that we make sure that we take a look at. Looks like Mr. Johnson has joined us tonight. Hey, Richard, how are you doing, buddy? You know what? As an intermediate defensive tool, Richard Johnson brings up that ballpoint pens work wonderfully well, and there's no doubt about it. I typically carry, and my friends at Great Lakes Tactical have my favorite pen, but I carry it right here in my shirt, and that's something that I have access to everywhere that I go, including on an airplane, including in a hospital, including in a school, and with a thumb over the top and a sharp enough point on this end, boy, that can be an outstanding tool. Definitely, Richard, I really appreciate you chiming in on that, and glad you came to join us. Hopefully the sound is okay and the video is working out for you down there in Florida. Enjoy your evening, sir, and if you have other thoughts, please make sure you chime in. You know, Grant, when we start to talk about the idea of avoidance and de-escalation and unarmed combatives and intermediate tools and then the response with a firearm, it gives us this really linear, ramped up appearance to violence. And I think one of the most important things that people can know and understand about violence is the idea that it isn't necessarily going to be one right after the other. As I alluded to with the awareness conversation, you know, noticing the bad guy and formulating what it is that he's about to do and your response to it, and then being able to verbally confront and then physically interact and then access some kind of an intermediate tool and then finally go to the firearm, that's just not how violence works. Violence tends to be much more like a light switch. You go to whatever level you need to go to. You go there instantly, and you go there with everything it is that you have to solve the situation. We can't think, or we shouldn't spend all of our time thinking about violence as some kind of a continuum. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the idea of escalation of force is not something that we really should be dealing with. If we're talking about social violence, of course, we generally have a pretty good idea of what's coming, or at least we should. One of the skills that we should have is some knowledge of both verbal and physical cues to understand what people are doing, where they're planning to go. If we talk about asocial violence, predatory violence, our response is going to be dictated by the attack coming. That's really the first cue that we're going to have, and part of our decision-making process is learning how to interpret what's going on and then executing whatever physical skill that we need to deal with it. So here's where proper training really comes in, recognizing the kind of attack that we're dealing with, or the kind of violence that we're dealing with, and then executing a response that we have to that is where we start talking about training. All the rest of the stuff sort of is certainly good. It's good to practice, but here's where the training comes in: recognizing the attack and then executing whatever skill that we've chosen to defeat that attack. This idea that we're going to start with verbal de-escalation, and we're going to go to a Kubotan, and going to go to pepper spray, and then we're going to go to our that really doesn't happen.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Somebody once said that the weapon you have in your hand at the beginning of the fight is the one you're going to have at the end of the fight, and it's important to understand that. This is why it's so critical to avoid these things in the first place.
Absolutely, Grant. I agree with that wholeheartedly. When we think about that violence, we have to understand that it can jump from one stage, at the beginning of the spectrum, all the way to the other, or the end of the spectrum immediately. And again, I like to think of it as a light switch. It's either all the way on or all the way off. It's not a dimmer switch. And whatever the appropriate measure is, that's what we need to execute to our fullest ability at that time. And the key to knowing what it is that we need to do is that recognition that you talked about. I was on the phone with another trainer today and telling stories, and we were laughing about one of our compadres in the industry. And I was in an armed combatives course with the compadre we were chit-chatting about. And part of that course was standing, toe-to-toe and learning about your partner's abilities and desires and their attributes in training. We're in headgear, we've got mouth guards, and the idea was, bam, give them a pop. Start out at 10%, ramp it up to 15, to 20, to 30. And at some point in time, you say, time out, that's enough. You don't need to hit me any harder than that. And I remember saying at about 30%, that's plenty for me. And the guy picked on me for being a sissy. And my point to him was the idea of, I don't need to get hit hard. That's not necessarily going to help me to win the fight. But seeing the punch come over and over and over and over again is going to help me to recognize in the future when that big right hook is coming, or when that big bear hug is coming. And that's really what it is that we need to try and work towards, is that recognition. Richard, I'm glad that you think the sound sounds fantastic. I wonder, how fantastic it sounds. Maybe you can come up with a dollar value to that. But sticking with my point, Grant, how is it that we train to be able to recognize? And this is really the crux of training. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons that scenario-based training has started to become very big now. We can train physical skills all the time. We can train for processing information. What's really hard to do is train the information that we're processing. Right? So we've got those pieces together. And scenario training is great for that. One-on-one in the unarmed combatives, it's sparring. In lethal force, we're talking about scenario-based, sometimes called reality-based training, is a wonderful way. Of course, you have to have the skill that you're going to execute prior to going into that. Because if you don't have the unarmed skills, what to do with your hands, or you don't have the weapon skills, what to do with that gun, going directly into those things doesn't do you any good. You have to have the foundational skills, the physical parts of it first, and then the application of it, which is that recognition of what's going on and then executing that skill. That's where that comes in. And it requires sort of a well-rounded package, not just the practice of the physical skills, but the practice of the application of those skills.
And that really is the key, Grant. And I think you pointed out very well with the idea that we need to make sure that we train that appropriately, that application of the skill. And that's an excellent evaluation phase. There's no doubt about it. When we get into that scenario-based training, and of course, you need to train with someone that really understands scenario-based training. There are safety issues that are involved. There are complexity issues that are difficult to sort out from a training standpoint. And so dealing with someone that's an expert in that area certainly is a great idea. Grant, as we start to wrap up here, I want to open the floor to you a little bit. What other areas do you think we need to talk about, or do you think we've covered it pretty well tonight?
Well, I think that we need to step out and simply look at the big picture. That remember that safety is not, personal safety is not any one thing. I like to talk about it in terms of an onion. It's got lots of layers and reinforcing parts of it. So certainly the lethal force skills are one part of it in the response. Certainly the unarmed skills are part of it, but also managing our attention, managing distraction, the pre-planning, the abandonment of ego. All of that stuff factors in to this whole that we're putting together. Remember that the weapons parts are the response phase. That's the innermost part of the onion. That's where things have really gotten bad enough that all that other stuff didn't stop it. So we need to take a holistic approach to it in terms of our personal safety, and not just say, well, I can shoot well, I'm perfectly safe now.
Right. Because
that's not really what it's all about.
Yeah, I agree, Grant. I think those are excellent points for us to start to head on out with. Very good points, and hopefully, folks, you understand where it is that we're coming from this holistic approach. We very much feel it's important when we think about the critical skills to understand that these skills we've talked about today might be the most important skills, because they can help you to avoid all of the consequences of violence that you may be faced with. If you can simply avoid the situation or use some tool other than a lethal force tool, then you're much better off. Now, that being said, when the situation requires for that lethal force tool, you need to be ready for that as well. To think that you're going to be able to solve every problem without lethal force is probably naive. And that's why it is that we do what it is that we do. Grant, I know that you've got courses that are coming up. You're going to be coming here in July, the 12th and the 13th, here in Cleveland, Ohio. Richard Johnson is saying that he's got to jump out, but he thinks the show looks great. Richard is coming up to Ohio for a revolver class. We've got Florida coming. We've got New Mexico coming. You're coming from out in Oregon. We've got a whole bunch of people coming from all around the country to train. Folks, if you're interested in training your revolver, learning the fundamentals of how to run that gun, Grant literally is the guy that wrote the book on the defensive revolver. Grant, why don't you talk just a little bit about the course and what it is that students can expect if they come out to that course, or when they come out to that course?
Well, what we're going to be talking about is, of course, the physical manipulation of the revolver, and we're going to learn the most efficient ways to run the revolver, the things that we've learned now over the last century about the best ways to run the revolver, and more importantly, the best ways to run what is a fairly difficult gun to use in situations where we don't have really, really good control over muscles and motor movements and things. So we're going to learn a lot of really efficient techniques to do that. And then once we've gotten that down, once we've learned how to do that, we're going to learn how to apply those skills that we've learned in a shooting situation. So we're going to do a lot of things in terms of processing information and in terms of intuitive shooting techniques, things like that. It's a great course, and by the way, it's applicable even if you use an autoloader. Don't bring one to this class, but it's also applicable if you use an autoloader. All the parts that we talk about in terms of intuitive shooting and in terms of responding to threat, those are all the same. So if you've got a snub nose revolver that you carry maybe during the week, or you've got a revolver in your nightstand because that's what your wife, you believe your wife is capable of using because she hasn't gotten trained yet. Bring those out. We'll learn how to use them most efficiently, and then how to apply that information to those situations where you actually need to shoot. It's going to be a great course.
Yeah, those of you that are watching this video in the replay, you'll see that there is a link that's been up on the screen. Go ahead, click on that link, and that will take you to the place where you can find out more details about the course and get yourself registered. Joseph has got a great question for us. Joseph is somebody that I spent some time with. He came out to the MAG 20 course that Masada Ayub put on here in Cleveland, Ohio this past February. He braved the winter weather, and we had some serious winter weather to come out and train with Safety Solutions Academy and Masada Ayub Group and Masada Ayub. And his question is what is it that you do to improve awareness? And can you be too aware or maybe paranoid? And I think this is an absolutely fabulous question. Grant, I'll let you run with that first. Can you be too aware, paranoid, or how do you improve that awareness?
Well, the first thing is you can't improve your awareness in the sense that you can't increase the amount of awareness you have. And I think this is a common misconception, in the self-defense world. You have a certain amount of awareness to spend, a certain amount of awareness to divvy up, and I prefer to call it attention because that's what it really is. So you have a certain amount of attention to divvy up through all the things that are happening. And I think of it in terms of a pie. If you spend a big slice of that pie on your cell phone, you have much smaller amounts to spend on the traffic that's crossing the street and the guy that's walking down the street and all the other stuff that you need to deal with. So you can only manage that awareness, that amount of attention you have, and learning to do that is as much a decision as it is practice. You have to first decide that I'm going to apportion my attention to those places where I believe it's more important at the time. That being said, yeah, I think the problem with becoming paranoid is one that I think, especially when we start to talk about awareness in the traditional senses, a lot of people will say, gosh, I can't live in condition yellow or orange or whatever it is this week. I just go paranoid. And it's not a matter of living in any condition. It's a matter of understanding that I'm going to choose where to put my attention. If, for instance, I'm at dinner with my wife, some of my attention is going to be looking at my wife and talking with her. Or if I were single and on a date, part of it would be looking deep into my date's eyes and making a connection, all that sort of thing. And I understand that attention that I'm giving is going to result in less attention to all the other stuff going around. But I made a conscious decision to do that, and as soon as I can, I might break away to reapportion my attention to other stuff for a while to see what's going on. So it's a matter of, I think people get paranoid when they believe that something can happen without their knowledge. And just accept that, yes, sometimes things are going to happen without your knowledge. That's where the response skills come in. And also understanding that you have a life to live. And it's important that you live that life. And by deciding where you're going to apportion that attention, what you're going to do on a daily basis, or perhaps even a minute-to-minute basis, that, I think, is how you avoid being paranoid. Understanding that, sometimes you just got to stop and smell the flowers.
Isn't that the truth, Grant? I picked up a quote someplace, don't even remember what the quote said, but I posted it up this week, and it said, forget about your six for just a minute and go ahead and be in the moment in whatever it is that you're doing. Otherwise, what's the point? And I think that might be what Joseph is getting at is, what's the point of existing if we're always constantly concerned about what it is that's going to happen to us? And there's a couple of different ways that I approach this. And I think Grant's talking about attention and the idea of choosing what it is that you pay attention to is really part of the key. And the other is balance. I always encourage people to look at awareness from a balanced standpoint. I'm not looking for bad things. I'm looking for outstanding things. I'm looking for things that are wonderfully fabulous and great as much as I'm looking for the bad thing on the opposite end of the spectrum. And when I approach awareness from that standpoint, Like you mentioned, the wonderful thing out on the date with my wife is being able to look into her eyes and have a deep conversation. That's wonderful and outstanding, and I want to pay attention to that. Just like I might want to pay attention and change my attention if, a guy with a black hoodie on comes through the door with a shotgun in his hand. The conversation is probably going to be different at that point in time. We have to look at it from both ends of the spectrum. Look for the wonder in life as much as you look for the scary part of life. And if we keep that balance, we can't get paranoid. When I say look at things that are outstanding, I literally mean that. When I learn to focus my attention where it needs to be, what I'm looking for is things that are out of place, things that are different than normal, things that don't fit in the world. And those are things that I give additional attention to. Almost always it's nothing, it's just an oddity. But those are the kinds of things that I think are important to pay attention to, is the things that just don't quite seem to be what they should be. They probably aren't to some degree, and we can learn a lot from those kinds of situations. And so, Joseph, great question. Hopefully those give you some ideas about how we approach things. I tried for a long time to live my life in condition yellow, sit with my back in the corner so I could see the doors and know the exits and everything else, and the fact of the matter is after a while it gets tiring. But if I just seek balance in my life, that's when things seem to fall into place. Any thoughts on that, Grant?
Paul, the great philosopher Ferris Bueller once said, life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Yep, absolutely. And then I think his buddy dumped a Porsche out the back window.
Yeah, wow.
Not good. But well, Grant, I've enjoyed this conversation as I always do. I think that it's fabulous, the two of us being able to bounce ideas off each other the way that we do when we have these conversations. And I tell you what, I'm really looking forward to our next conversation about critical defensive skills. Again, those of you that are interested in training your revolver and the critical skills that are related to your revolver, make sure you head to safetysolutionsacademy.com. Again, there's a link on the screen you can click on and check that out and get registered. If you're interested in the critical defensive handgun skills course that I teach through Safety Solutions Academy, you can click on the link on the screen there to find out more information. I'm actually going to jump off the call here. It's 10:22 Eastern Time. I've got a little bit of packing up to do and need to get the truck hooked up to the trailer because I am teaching all weekend long. We've got students coming in from all around Ohio for critical defensive handgun skills, a 2-day course. It's going to be a great weekend. If you're interested, make sure you check out the details on the course and get yourself registered. We've got several courses scheduled throughout the summer. It's definitely a course that's worthwhile, and it's pretty well thought out for what it is that those critical defensive skills are that we talk about. Grant, next week, next Thursday, are you ready for critical defensive skills and the handgun? I think that's where we're headed next. What are those critical skills? You ready for it?
We're ready. Let's do it.
Excellent. So, folks, what I want to encourage you to do is I want to encourage you to send in your emails. Just like you did last week talking about critical defensive skills, focus them in on the handgun. I want to know what the skills are that you think are the most important, the skills that are critical, and we're going to talk about those skills, what it is they mean to us from a defensive standpoint, and how it is we can work to unravel training for those skills to have them ready to go. Grant, again, I want to say thanks so much for taking the time to join us tonight. We really appreciate you scarfing down your dinner real quick to be on the call with us. I look forward to chatting with you next Thursday. Grant, anything else you want to let people know before you head out?
No, just visit my site at personalsecurity.us, and if you have any questions, email me at grant@personalsecurity.us, and be glad to answer them. I'm looking forward to next week because it's going to be a great conversation.
Excellent, Grant. Thanks so much. Folks, you'll find me at safetysolutionsacademy.com, and if you have those emails for us, go ahead and you can comment here on the video on YouTube in the Google Hangout event, or send your emails to Paul at safetysolutionsacademy.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Make sure that you get on out there, get yourself some training. When you do, please make sure you keep it simple. Stay safe, and as always, have a great day.